thank you all for being here. And it's there are a lot of you, which is exciting. It's fun. I'm a St. John's alumnus in my undergraduate degree. So I graduated from St. John's in 1998. Spent 17 years as a professor in Iowa, St. Ambrose University. And it was always my dream to come back to St. John's. And frankly, I thought I had become too old for that to happen. But here I am. It's my second year here at St. John's. It's been very special. And there are people in the community here today that I know from way back in the day. My parents are here, which is kind of fun. Brother Paul Jasmer is here. I'm sorry to single you out, but he and I worked together in the library when I had a work-study job there back in the 90s. My kid's baseball coach is here from the prep school. So anyway, somebody from my parish. Anyway, it's fun to be part of this community. What's going on here? Okay, here's where I click. Okay. When they asked me to do Theology Day, they wanted it on the topic of hope. And I thought, oh, great. I'm a Minnesota sports fan. Okay. So I guess at one level, all we have is hope, right? So I'm well conditioned for this, but we also have been sort of ground down into a nub of pessimism. It's a survival tactic, right? And so maybe some of us as Christians feel that way as well, given the current state of the world. And so then I thought, well, what would be a fun, interesting thing for people like you? And I love kind of talking about weird stuff. I like taking people deep into the weeds, okay? So we're going to talk about archaeology, and I'm going to show you piles of rocks that don't mean anything really. And so I thought, well, that would be fun. But then I started thinking, okay, Corinth would be perfect, but how do we get to hope in the midst of that? And I'm still not exactly sure how we're going to get there, okay? I think I know, but maybe we can work on it together as we're talking through some of the details of what Paul has to say in this letter, etc. So that's our big picture plan. Actually, let me get out my notes, but here's the overview. Normally when I do this, I have a screen in front of me, but I've got it all here. I want to start today with just a brief overview on the Apostle Paul. I don't know most of you. I don't know what you know. Maybe you think you know some things about Paul that I can help you unlearn. I'm glad you laughed at that. So that's step one, okay? Step two, then, is we're going to talk a little bit about Corinth before we get super specific. What do we know about when Paul wrote this letter, why he wrote it, what was that city like, etc. And then we'll take a deeper dive into two specific spots in 1 Corinthians in particular. One has to do with food. The other has to do with body parts. I promise we'll get to the body parts, okay? So, and those might seem strange, but we're going to look at tangible things in the archaeological record that I think help kind of illuminate and unlock what it is that Paul was trying to say 2,000 years ago. And then we'll do maybe what is in some ways the hardest work of translating that ancient message into a key that we can listen to today. Okay, so that's kind of the plan overall. And I want to just lay my cards on the table at the beginning of sort of here's the thesis with which I'm working. Maybe it's more of a hunch. And we'll see how it plays out as we go through these different pieces of content. But my thesis is this: hope for Paul in 1 Corinthians is always grounded in seeking the good of the other. That may seem like a very strange way to define hope. Quite often when I hear people talk about hope, there's something about, Well, even in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, hope is something that, believing in something that we can't see. I don't think that's really how Paul thinks about it. So we'll see how that plays out. So I want to start by just asking you, what do you know about Paul? Just popcorn comments of something and maybe I already warned you off of saying anything that I'm going to tell you if you're wrong. Don't worry about that. This is a safe space. Okay. He calls himself a Pharisee. Okay. He traveled a lot. Okay. Say that again. A Roman citizen. Okay.
Persecuted Christians.
Persecuted Christians. Yes. Maybe the first missionary. Okay. God knocked him off the horse. Very good. What's that? You love him or you hate him. Why would you hate Paul? Anybody want to answer that?
Abrasive.
He was abrasive, right?
Long sentences.
He sometimes wrote long sentences, prepositional phrases. When you learn Greek, you often start with the Gospel of John, which is just very easy to translate. And the first time you open up Galatians, you're like, oh my God, seems like a different language. Other things you know about Paul? Anything else we should? Thorn. He had some ailment with which he suffered throughout his life. Is that what you're talking about? Yeah. We don't know what it was, but he talks about it being recurring. Anything else?
Recommended that you not get married.
He did. Yep.
You did?
I'm not going to touch that one. Somebody said he recommended that you should not get married. And yeah, I'm not going to talk about that one. So these are all great things. Maybe I just want to start by commenting briefly on you love him or you hate him. It's an interesting comment, right? And so, yes, Paul was abrasive at times, although he often is also very loving and intimate. And there's a great article called St. Paul, Our Mother, which is trying to draw out all the times that Paul uses maternal imagery in his ministry. So that he does have there are two sides to that coin, I think. But in particular, women should be suspicious of Paul. He tells women to be silent. How's that going? Well, too well, probably, right? He condoned slavery. And to this day, there is much justified suspicion of Paul in a lot of African American churches in the United States. There are, I think, two sides to those coins as well, because Paul also gives us a lot of language about liberation and freedom. Paul also, when we see on the ground how he practices his ministry, clearly has women who are in his orbit on whom he relied. We're going to meet one of them today in the first chapter of 1 Corinthians. So it's complicated. It's complicated. Maybe that's the best way to say it and just leave it. One of the things we're going to talk about in a minute is that a lot of the details that you all just gave me, getting knocked off the horse, being a Roman citizen, these are details that come not from Paul's letters. Okay, I'll reiterate this in a minute. But in the New Testament, we also have this big book called the Acts of the Apostles, the whole second half of which focuses on Paul and his conversion and his role as a missionary in the early church. Paul didn't write that. And it was written decades after he was dead by somebody who never knew him. And so we have to, I call Acts, it's like the Hollywood version of Paul's life. It's like the Disney version. And so we can't always treat it 100% reliably as a historical source for his life. Okay. I'm just going to drop that bomb and then leave it. Okay, so if you want to talk about that more, we can, but on the side. Okay, great. So I just want to show you a basic timeline of where Paul drops into the era of the New Testament in the first century. Okay, so if we have this timeline in the first century, the first thing obviously we need for Christianity and the church is the life of Jesus. The earliest gospel that we think was written is the Gospel of Mark, right around 69 or 70 of the first century. I think this is a fairly well-educated audience, so I don't know that that's a surprising information for anyone, but if it is, I apologize. Then Matthew, Luke, and John come a little bit later. And so Paul's letters really kind of bridge the gap here of what is happening in the first 20, 30 years of the life of the church. It's very hard to date Paul's career with any type of precision. We have some ideas. Actually, 1 Corinthians is one of the letters we can date with the most precision. But we're talking his career is somewhere between 40 and 60, the years 40 and 60 in the first century. Okay, so he falls in that time frame. And what is so, well, weird, I guess, or interesting or intriguing about Paul's letters is if you look at this timeline, you might think, well, that's a long gap between the life of Jesus and when our first gospel was written down, and certainly even longer before Matthew, Luke, and John are written down. How nice that we have Paul to be a source for Jesus in that intervening period. Wrong. Paul, in his letters, basically tells us nothing about the life of Jesus. He talks a lot about Jesus's death and resurrection, but Paul never talks about any of Jesus's miracles, never mentions a single one, never mentions any of Jesus's parables, any of the healing stories, anything about Jesus's birth, really. I mean, he mentions that he was born. So Paul is almost useless as a source for the historical Jesus. Okay. With, I guess, one exception in 1 Corinthians 7, he says, there's one time he says, "This command I have from the Lord, don't get divorced." That's it. That's the only time he quotes Jesus directly, for the most part. So, what that suggests to us is that Paul is doing something, not that it's not grounded in history, but he is actively interpreting what he thinks is the essence of the Jesus event for various communities that are scattered across the Roman world. Okay. So Paul is born in the city of Damascus, in Tarsus, which is in the kind of on the far right hand of this map. And as somebody said early in his life, he was violently persecuting the church. And then he starts, he has this conversion experience, okay? The bit about, I have the picture of him in a minute of getting knocked off the horse. That is sort of the Hollywood version of it. All he says in Galatians when he tells the story is that he had a revelation. The word revelation in Greek is the word apocalypse. So it's a dramatic word that changes his life. And then he goes around to these regions, starting churches, getting these communities up and running. Once they're up and running, and he feels like they're sufficient enough, he moves on to the next place. So some of this just summarizes what I've been saying. The issue of Paul's letters versus the Acts of the Apostles. Historically speaking, we have to prioritize the letters. And that's not to say that everything in Acts of the Apostles is made up. There's a lot of convergence there, but there are some differences. We also have to remember that even Paul, when he's telling a story in one of his genuine letters, I don't know if this sounds dramatic, but he also has a rhetorical aim in that letter. And I'm not sure he can always be trusted because he might tell a story in such a way as to try to convince his community to see things the way that he wants them to be seen. Does that make sense? So we always have to have that filter on as well. It's not that when Paul tells us something, we need to stop and think, okay, does this line up with other things we know? So we always need to remember Paul himself is engaged in various forms of rhetoric and persuasion. It doesn't take much to get you to laugh. So Paul wrote letters. I just want to pause and linger over that for a minute as well. Why do we write letters? I mean, who writes letters anymore? It's kind of a lost art, isn't it? Several years ago, I acquired from somebody's basement a typewriter. And for a couple of years, I was writing people typed notes that I would send in the mail. And I ran out of steam. I haven't done it. And then when we moved here a year and a half ago, the typewriter did not make the cut. But why do we write letters? You don't, especially in the ancient world, you would never sit down and write a letter for no reason. Paul himself didn't write any of his letters. He always had a scribe. Okay. The scribe was probably responsible for even perhaps the rhetorical shape of some of the letters, because that in scribal culture, they were trained to do that very thing. Paul probably said, here's the stuff I want to say, you know, kind of like you can do now with ChatGPT, make it sound good. In fact, in some of the letters, at the end, the scribe sort of raises his hand and said, I'm the scribe who wrote this. Also, at the end of Galatians, Paul says, look what big letters I use when I write with my own handwriting. He's really upset at the Galatians. And it's as if he takes the quill out of the scribe's hand and writes in his own letters. And because handwriting and scribal work was a very specific occupation in the ancient world, Paul's handwriting probably looked like a kindergartner's letters because you just didn't do it very often. So there's a lot of fascinating details that sort of, when we think about, oh, Paul is the author of this and Paul was an apostle, there are these interesting kind of layers that stand between whatever Paul thought and what we read when we open up the New Testament. The other part of Paul being a letter writer that's important is just the fact that his letters are always highly contextual, right? Letters are written to specific occasions and for specific reasons. And we're going to talk about that in Corinthians, what those reasons are, why Paul wrote these letters. And it's really important that we keep that in mind when we study Paul. A few years ago, I was teaching an intro theology class back in Iowa, and I had this really nice student. She sat in the front row. She cared about her faith. She was very earnest, and I appreciated having her in class because undergraduates like that are they're like a gold nugget that doesn't come along very often. And that was a joke, but and so we were starting the unit on Paul. She came into class and she sat down and she was frustrated, and she said, I'm really struggling because I can't figure out what Paul is trying to say to me. And I can sometimes be a little sarcastic. Is that true? Yeah, okay. And so I said back to her, I said, well, that's not a surprise because he didn't write it to you. And she just started weeping. So believe it or not, that experience has taught me to scale back my sarcasm. So it used to be worse. So I feel bad about that. But what I said is true. Paul didn't write any of these letters to us. And in fact, I think, I'm not sure I totally agree with what I'm about to say, but I think if Paul knew we were still reading them, I think he would be shocked. Because they weren't written for 21st century Collegeville. So we just have to keep that in mind. I'm not trying to say they're irrelevant, obviously. I've committed my life to the study of the New Testament. But the contextual nature of the letters is super important, okay? And it presents all of these challenges. The challenges about slavery, the challenges about what he says about women. There are lots of other issues like that where we have to remember the ways in which these letters are embedded in an ancient culture and the way in which they are written to particular circumstances. And so that's part of what I'm going to try to help us understand today. For example, in 1 Corinthians 8, when Paul talks about food that's been sacrificed to an idol, that has nothing to do with our world today. Did anybody had a muffin this morning? Okay.
Good.
What, yeah, they're good. Was that muffin sacrificed to Apollo? Could have been. Did you stop and ask? Okay, so that is exactly the issue in 1 Corinthians 8. I'm getting ahead of myself, but we're gonna stop and think through some of those issues. One way I've heard this said, and I'm stealing this from another scholar, is that Paul does his theology on a napkin. Okay, doesn't mean he was literally at a cafe, but it means he's writing in a particular situation, often in the heat of the moment. Okay, so he also isn't necessarily trying to set down eternal Christian doctrine when he's writing. He's trying to put out fires and solve problems. It's highly contextual. Okay. So that's kind of, yeah, go ahead. I was just going to stop and ask for questions. So that's kind of the end of just very, very big introduction to thinking about Paul, who Paul was, and a little bit about his life. So I'd be happy to just answer a couple of questions, make sure we're all kind of comfortable, feel like we're on the same page, and then we'll look specifically at Corinth. So we do have a microphone so that the people online can hear what you're saying.
Very good. Is this good?
Yeah.
So I have read some people, some priests that have written, and I've read in a couple of places where the oldest versions of the New Testament did not include that section on women covering themselves and they should be quiet. Have you encountered any of that?
Well, sure, but it's not true. So there are scholarly theories about, so 1 Corinthians chapter 14, when Paul tells women to be silent. That is in every manuscript. Okay. There are theories that scholars have come up with about how that could be what we call a later interpolation. So there's some sort of signals when you read that section in Greek, it kind of, the syntax sort of changes and it's sort of stuck in there awkwardly. And so scholars say, I can see how this was added later. But there is no manuscript support for that. Same with chapter 11 about head coverings. No manuscript support for that not being there. So isn't it convenient that we come up with, I'd love it if it wasn't there, just to be clear. But it's not a manuscript issue. It's a scholar looking for a theory for why maybe it wasn't there originally. Does that distinction make sense? Yeah. There are lots of places in the New Testament where something was not there originally. The longer ending of Mark's gospel. When Jesus says on the cross in the Gospel of Luke, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing," added later. That probably shouldn't be in the Bible. But unfortunately, the statement about women in 1 Corinthians 14, not a manuscript issue. Yep.
Just a simple question. Did Paul have the same scribe for all of his letters or different ones?
Did he have the same scribe? We really don't know. Probably he often had the same person. You could imagine a school or a group of, trusted advisors. But we don't know the answer to that. I think one letter names the scribe at the end, but that's the only one. Yeah.
Could you comment further on this Hollywood version of the Acts of the Apostles and St. Paul? And when were the Acts actually written? And how did that end up referring to Paul as it did in the last part of the Acts?
Yeah, sure. So in Acts of the Apostles, as I said, Luke's gospel is probably dated around, Paul's letters, middle of the 1st century, right? The Acts of the Apostles is written by the same author as the author of the Gospel of Luke, okay? And we often refer to those two books as Luke Acts. In the New Testament, they get split up by the Gospel of John, because in the ancient world, they didn't care about authorship when they were putting the Bible together in that same way. So Luke, there are lots of details we could go into as to sort of how and why we date Luke and Acts towards the end of the 1st century. It has to do with how the Jewish temple is depicted, which seems clearly to have already been destroyed by the Romans, some other literary factors as well. And so if you think about what Luke is doing, Luke is trying to continue this story of Jesus that in the other Gospels all ends with the resurrection into the early church. But again, he's doing it later. He's doing it for a different audience. And by the time Luke is doing it, Paul is probably already sort of I don't want to say a mythological creature or a figure, but like a figure of great renown within the church. And I think Luke is kind of breathing some more life into a dramatic picture there. And if you read Acts carefully, it's really not about Paul at all. It's not about Peter, those stories. Those stories are always about God and about the Holy Spirit. The humans in the Acts of the Apostles are just pawns on the board. God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit are doing all of the work. So it's just Luke is engaging in a very different kind of, maybe this is the last part of answering that. Luke is doing something that would align with an ancient understanding of historiography. So we have lots of ancient historians like Herodotus, Thucydides, the Jewish historian Josephus, who wrote quasi-historical narratives, but not in accordance with how today we think about history. The standards for ancient history were quite different. And so what that means is they took a lot of liberties, okay? So today, if you go to, does Barnes & Noble still exist? Yeah, okay. So if you go to Barnes & Noble and you take a history book off the shelf, you expect that if it gives you a date or something happened on such and such a day, that's going to be accurate. In the ancient world, that was not how they thought about historiography. They were trying to get at the core and the essence of a situation. In fact, the Greek historian Thucydides says at the beginning of his history of the Peloponnesian War, he says, I wasn't here for all of these events, but if I had been there, here's what this person should have said, right? So that's how they thought about history. It's an interpretive genre. It actually kind of still is today in some ways, right? But so we could talk about that more if you want, but that's kind of in a snapshot of really why the Acts of the Apostles looks the way that it does. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to maybe take my shoes off because this is sacred ground. I'm going to talk about why do we hear Paul, or what would Paul say with every time the lectionary is opened? Here's some more of Paul's letters. And if they were so contextual, we're hearing Paul all the time. And are we able to really put it in context? I'm
What do you mean, are we?
can be argumentative,
no,
but
no.
like, boy, Paul's really strongly featured in our lectionary.
Yeah.
Right?
And when was the last time you heard a homily preached on Paul?
Yeah.
Ever?
Yeah.
Not super often, right? And there's a lot of reasons for that. I have sort of well, let me say it this way. And I have some books out in the hallway. And my most recent book, I spent time in Greece and Turkey to try to work on bringing Paul more to bear on, in this particular case, Catholic social teaching. So the book's not specifically about Paul, but there's a lot of stuff about Paul in it to try to bend this curve the other way. The church has a lot of work to do, I think, because Paul, I think, is an incredible resource for our theology if we took the time to understand it and, like I said earlier, translate it into something that people could digest. But it's harder than the Gospels. It's not narratives. Like a parable, it's just so much easier, lower hanging fruit to try to spin into a homily. So yeah, especially this is very different if you're from a Protestant background, right? Paul there is like, I mean, they argue till they're blue in the face to get Paul right. And Catholics, we just ignore it. So yeah, or you're left on your own to try to figure out what to do with it. Yeah. So it's kind of sad because in some ways I think the church has failed lay people in helping them figure out, because it's not that hard. You know, you got to do a little work, but it's not. Tell me at the end today, is this beyond any of you? I don't think so. Yeah. Okay, maybe the last one, and then we should probably move on.
Okay,
Yep.
This might be off topic, I'm not sure. Why did people believe Paul? Why was he able to start all those churches? I know.
It's a really good question. Why did people believe Paul? I mean, you could ask that question in the ancient world. You can still ask it today. It was kind of the subtext of the previous question. Am I right? Like, do we really need this guy? Okay. Yeah, you didn't say that, but there are legitimate theologians who have argued that we should take Paul out of the Bible. Okay. So it's really interesting actually so you get this in a lot of places in Paul, but go back to what I said earlier about how Paul says that his understanding of the gospel, his conversion was the result of an apocalypse, a revelation, a lifting of the veil, a radical breaking of God into the time and space of humanity. That's where his authority comes from. And in fact, if you read in Galatians chapters 1 and 2, this is where Paul kind of gives his little story, his conversion story. He then says, I had this apocalypse, and then he's very, very careful to say, I did not go running to Jerusalem to have it approved by Peter and James and what he calls the supposed pillars. This is the other reason Catholics don't like Paul, is because Paul did not like Peter. There's no evidence that they got along. And in Galatians, he ends up yelling at Peter and calling him a hypocrite in front of the whole church in Antioch. But anyway, I got now off track. So, but his authority, he always says, is because it comes straight from God as part of a revelation. You can imagine a scenario in a religious community that is infused with fervor, spiritual fervor, that works really great. Doesn't work so well with an 18-year-old freshman in college. Oh, this man, who by the way hates women, heard a voice from God 2,000 years ago. Let's figure, yeah, he claims he heard a voice from God 2,000 years ago. Let's dig in, right? I mean, it's not, it's a hard sell, right? So for Roman Catholics, there's a different way of answering the question, which is over time, the church has, through a traditioning process, decided that some books are good and true and useful to be included in the canon of Scripture, and some did not. That's a very different way of answering the question, and they both, I think, have to kind of be taken into account. So yeah, for Paul, it all comes straight from God. All right. What time did we start? 9. Okay. We better move on. Is everybody okay? Okay. We do take a break at some point. Okay. So. All right. To drill down a little farther, I know some of you told me before we started today that you've been to Corinth. Okay. You have as well? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Quite a few of you. Okay. So do you know anything about Corinth, or those of you who have been there? What were you told when you were there?
Well, we were told that that's where Paul was held on trial. We were shown supposedly judge's seat where he was. The judge says, "No, you're okay. You can go."
Okay. Yep. The Bema. It's called the Bema. It's right in the center of the
Yes.
city. Okay. Yep. I'm going to show you a picture of that. We'll talk about that more in a minute. So this is kind of the central point in the center of Corinth, where people are told that Paul was put on trial there and whatever. So okay, good. Yep.
We heard that he was so ridiculously ignored in Athens. You know, there is no letter to the Athenians.
Yeah.
That Corinth was the next town down the road. It's about
Okay.
a half an hour west, hour west of Athens by
Yep.
car, I think.
Yep. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. All right.
Well, we were there with you,
Yeah,
so
no,
we
you better
got
get it right.
everything correct. So we went to the Bema, and I said, "Oh, I got to get up on there and preach the family a little sermon like Paul did." And you said he didn't preach from there because he says in his letter, "I came to you in quietness," and I forget the exact
Yeah.
words.
I'm gonna quote that in a minute.
Oh,
So,
okay,
yep, mhm,
okay.
Yep.
Well, so that's one thing I learned, but I still preached the sermon
Oh, yeah,
anyway.
yeah. I think it was,
And a rainbow came out right behind me.
Well, the other thing you notice being there is just the geography.
Mhm.
When you think about Greece as a physical entity, that narrowing down and pinching down created a place where a city was going to be built, either for north-south traffic or east-west.
yeah, good. Yep. And I'm gonna show you a map. We'll talk more about that too. Yep, great. Yep, one more over here. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, obviously, it was a large city. Commerce was huge. They're on the sea. They're near land. A lot of places are nearby, so they were just a huge commerce.
Yeah, yeah, very good. Yep, and we're gonna talk some more about that as well. Yep. And in fact, just to editorialize on that, based on the comment about being ignored in Athens, I mean, the story about Paul in Athens, where does that come from? The Acts of the Apostles, okay? And it's a great story. Paul stands up in the Areopagus and he I see all of these unknown gods and I proclaim to you this unknown God, yeah, probably, right? Really, that is Luke's theology put into the mouth of Paul, if that makes sense. And the reason Paul does in 1 Thessalonians say that he stopped in Athens for a little bit. The reason he went to Corinth is because at that time Athens was not important. It was a cultural backwater by that point. Corinth was the important city in Achaia at that time. So that's really the reason probably why Paul went there. But anyway, we'll come back to that too.
We were told that Paul was a tent maker and became friends with two people who traveled with him after he left Corinth.
Yeah, Prisca and Aquila. Yeah, okay, yep. And again, I may repeat this, but Paul in his letters never says he was a tent maker. He clearly had some kind of trade in some sort of leather work, but the tent maker idea is in Acts 18:3. It's very plausible, but he never corroborates that in his letters. Okay. Is there anything online that we should give voice to? No? Okay. People online, you're more than welcome to type things in the, whatever it is, the Q&A. Okay, great. Anybody who hasn't been to Corinth, just things you know about, when I say 1 Corinthians, do you have an association of what's in that letter, what it's about, things Paul says there?
Love.
Love, okay. 1 Corinthians 13, yep. I would not I made very few decisions about our wedding, and one of them was I would not let that be the reading, just because it's at all weddings, but it's beautiful, it's great, yeah. Yeah.
At the Latin Mass that I attend, there's the annual readings we hear every year, the advisory on receiving the Eucharist in a state of grace.
Okay.
And the warning that if you're not in a state of grace, you bring judgment upon yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So like the guilt of, as I understand it, the guilt of the precious blood falls on you if you're not prepared to receive Jesus, if you're not understanding what your soul is about to commit to encountering in that moment. That's Corinthians, right?
Yeah, 1 Corinthians 11, Paul talks about, he never uses the word Eucharist, he uses the phrase Lord's Supper. And the church has definitely used that text to help build up its theology of an exclusive sacrament, right? For Roman Catholics. I don't know that that's really what Paul is thinking about. Really, when Paul's writing that, the problem is socio-economic. It's division between the rich and the poor, and there's a few other things going on there. But absolutely, that text has figured prominently in those discussions. Yeah. Okay, let's dive into some stuff about Corinth. We've already started that. I want to just briefly point out the structure. I don't think I need my Bible. The structure of the letter. Well, actually, no, I'm just going to read a little chunk. The overall big problem in Corinth is that the people are not unified. So let me just read the very opening. And this may sound familiar to some of you. So after Paul goes through the customary introductory elements of every Greco-Roman letter, in 1 Corinthians 1:10, he says this: "Now I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you be in agreement and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same purpose. For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels among you, my brothers and sisters. What I mean is that each of you says, I belong to Paul, or I belong to Apollos, or I belong to Cephas, or I belong to Christ. And he goes on from there. The overarching problem here is the people are divided up into little groups, little factions. They are not unified. Okay. And I'll bring this up, I think, throughout the rest of this morning's conversation, just because I think everything Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians is an attempt to try to create unity. Even so, in 1 Corinthians 11, when he talks about how women wear their hair and their need to be veiled, the implication there is that women are not following convention. If they weren't doing the wrong thing, Paul wouldn't have to write to them about it. But it's causing so much ruckus in the community. He just says, can we just do it the way everybody does it? And it's a frustrating argument, but it is related to his overall goal of the letter, which is if this church can't stay unified, they're not going to survive. Okay. The other interesting thing here is that we meet this person named Chloe, mentioned nowhere else in Scripture. Just this is her one cameo. We can try to infer some things about her from what Paul says. He uses this phrase, Chloe's people. What does that mean? We don't know. It could mean Chloe was a wealthy person who had a church gathering meeting in her home. It's one possibility. Chloe may have had slaves, could be referring to that. We don't know. But Chloe is of enough stature that Paul can name her and assume that the whole community knows who he's talking about, which is on its face interesting, just that point. And that Chloe somehow feels empowered enough to send a delegation to Paul to, be a tattletale on the rest of the community, right? So Chloe, I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, I don't know if you've ever had these conversations where you ask, if you could go back to one era of history, where would it go? I would maybe could I just follow Chloe around for a day? That would just be fascinating. I could come back and write a really good book. Anyway, so Paul, wherever he is when he's writing this letter, probably in Ephesus, we don't know for sure, but has received a report from Corinth about what's happening, right? Paul has already been there, got the church started, and then he leaves. In chapter 5, verse 1, then Paul says, it is actually reported, and then he goes on to talk about a bunch of issues with sexual morality. So this is also interesting. Seems like a different report, or maybe even some sort of rumor in Catholic circles, Christian circles, about what's going on in Corinth. Something has gotten back to Paul. Chapter 5, verse 9, Paul says, I wrote in my letter. So Paul has written to them already. What we call 1 Corinthians is actually 2 Corinthians. But we do not have whatever he wrote, the first one. Isn't that tantalizing? Yeah, doesn't exist for whatever reason. Finally, then, in chapter 7:1, 7:25, 8:1, and 12:1, Paul starts each of those sections with the same exact phrase in Greek. Now concerning, or now with regards to, and in 7:1 he actually spells it out. Now with regards to the things about which you wrote. So now we have evidence that they wrote a letter to Paul. And it seems like the second half of this letter is Paul simply answering questions that they had asked him. Okay, so in chapter 7, he talks about a bunch of different things. That's where he talks about divorce. He talks about some sexuality issues, about women who are in some sort of consecrated life. Chapter 8, it's the food sacrificed to idols that we're going to talk about in a minute. Chapter 12, it's about spiritual gifts. So the point of this is that we should not think about 1 Corinthians as some sort of one-off letter, right? There's this long history of interaction that we get glimpses of when you read 1 Corinthians. Paul, after he leaves, works hard to try to continue to maintain his pastoral role with this church. Okay. Does that make sense? Yeah. We also have 2 Corinthians, also written by Paul. And it's a little bit sad, but if you read 2 Corinthians, I think you get a sense that 1 Corinthians was a failure. The problems that Paul is addressing in 1 Corinthians, in 2 Corinthians, seem not to have disappeared, and in many cases maybe have gotten worse. And Paul seems much more sad and kind of despondent about some of them. If you have to kind of intuit his emotional space, but it's interesting. Okay. This is just a map, screenshot of Google Maps of where Corinth is today. And you can see it lies on, I think Deacon Steve, you were talking about this, on this little thin strip of land that connects the main part of Greece with the Peloponnesian Peninsula. Okay. The geographical term for a thin strip of land that connects two bigger pieces of land is called an isthmus. You've ever heard that word? Okay, an isthmus. That's an ancient Greek word. And this region, parts of it were actually called, in the ancient world, were called isthmia. And the games that were practiced in Corinth, which we'll talk about in a minute, were called the Isthmian Games. But this location is important. I think how Deacon Steve said it was that there was going to be a city there, right? You just look at it, you need a city there, both for north, south, east, west traffic. And that's indeed a big part of what was going on and what made Corinth very important. We don't have to get into this too much, but the city of Corinth was inhabited as far back as the Bronze Age. So 1200 BCE. So by the time Paul gets there, there's a history of more or less inhabitation in the city of Corinth for over 1200 years. Okay, that's a long time. We're about to celebrate the 300th anniversary of the United States? 250, sorry. Bad at math. I was born in the bicentennial year. I should know that. The year I turned 50, now you know how old I am. Anyway, this is a long time that people have been living there. Corinth was very influential in classical Greece. We think about Athens and Sparta as kind of the two best known city-states in the classical age. Corinth was a major, major player, contributing all sorts of things to the Peloponnesian War. So super important in that era. One of the things that made Corinth popular, and I think could be one of the reasons Paul wanted to spend time there, is because Corinth oversaw a set of games. So you've heard of the Olympic Games, right? But in the ancient Greek world, there were actually 4 sets of games called the Pan-Hellenic Games. There was the Olympic Games, the Isthmian Games, which is where Corinth is. There was the Nemean Games, and there was the games at Delphi. There were 4 where the whole world would shut down, the Greek world would shut down, and everybody would come and have these sacrifices and athletic contests, etc. And in fact, Paul, interestingly, uses athletic imagery in 1 Corinthians. Do you not know that in a race the runners all compete, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win it. Athletes exercise self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable one. So I do not run aimlessly, nor do I box as though beating the air, but I punish my body and enslave it, so that after proclaiming to others, I myself should not be disqualified. And that is imagery right out of ancient Greek games and athletics. Okay. And there's no accident there, I don't think. I think it's actually, if you think about Paul, right, from his point of view, he is trying to spread the gospel. He's wanting to start these churches. And he did that by going to lots of different places. But what would happen if he's in Corinth and the games are going on, right? Rather than him having to go all over, the whole world is coming to him. He never says that, but I suspect that was part of the logic of why he identified also Corinth as a place he wanted to spend some time, because that created an opportunity for evangelization. The last thing, sort of as the background history here, is that Corinth does kind of fall into some decay in the 1st century BCE. But in 44 BCE, the Romans saw Corinth as an important strategic location and refounded it as a Roman colony and as the capital of all of Achaia. That's all of central Greece. And so this meant that the Romans started pouring money into the city to build up the infrastructure. And when you go to visit Corinth today, most of what you see is a result of this process of the Romans pumping money into it. The reason Rome wanted to do that had to do with the strategic location of Corinth. So this is a slightly different map of central Greece. And you can again see where Corinth is located on the isthmus, okay? And Corinth, most of Corinth's economic importance relates to the ancient shipping industry. Shipping in the ancient world was super dangerous. People were dying all the time. There are ancient shipwrecks all over the Mediterranean. And in fact, one of the leading areas of archaeology right now is underwater archaeology. And they're amazing because they're undisturbed. They haven't been looted, and some of these things have been super important. What happened in Corinth is this route around the Peloponnesian Peninsula was known to be particularly dangerous. And so what happened is people started navigating their ships instead of around. They would go up through these islands, which are the Cycladic Islands. They would dock their ships at the isthmus, unload the cargo, pull the cargo across the isthmus, pull the ship across the isthmus, put it back in the water, reload the cargo, and then continue their journey on the way to Rome, or vice versa. Okay. Does that sound like a lot of work? Yeah, it was a lot of work. What's that? The Romans didn't dig a canal, but there's one there today. Yeah, I have a picture of it. Actually, Nero tried to dig a canal and didn't get very far. So they were pulling all of this stuff back and forth, and that is what Rome was interested in. What do you think Rome wanted to do to all of that economic activity? Tax it, yeah. Tariffs, yeah, right. When I asked my undergrads what Rome wanted and all that, they never get it because they haven't paid taxes yet, so. We have excavated the portage road where they pulled the stuff across. Okay. And you can, some of it's now underwater because of the canal. I'll show you that in a second. And you can kind of get a sense. I have a slightly better picture. Can you see the wheel ruts in the stone, right? You just get this sense of hundreds of years of pulling stuff across here. This one, you can really see the wheel ruts. It's, how long is it? I don't know exactly. It's 3 kilometers, something like that. It's not super far, but it's not short. It's not 100 yards. Yeah. And so I think I have one more picture, which is, yeah. When I go to Greece, my students make fun of me because I get excited about rocks. So they took this picture of me talking about the wheel ruts, and then they make fun of me. So this is what it looks like today. They've cut a canal, a very narrow canal. And not big ships can't go through there, but smaller ships can. So all of this, here's one more. This shows you this is kind of a helpful map too. So the dotted line is the route of the portage road. Okay. And you can see then the blue is where the modern day canal would be. Okay. I can have these slides emailed out if anybody would like that afterwards. So is that okay? If we do that afterwards, okay. So all of this then, you think about this, led Corinth to take on a certain reputation. Corinth became a crossroads of the ancient world. Don't we still today kind of have cultural associations about sailors? If any of you are sailors, I apologize if that offends you. You know, he swears like a sailor, that phrase. Corinth became known as a naughty place. There was a temple on the top of the Acrocorinth. I'll show you a picture of that in a second, where the ancient historian Pausanias tells us that there were 1,000 temple prostitutes associated with that temple to Aphrodite. Lots of our archaeology has found brothels there. So I don't know if you remember those old ads for Las Vegas, but what happened in Corinth stayed in Corinth. Okay, that's kind of the idea. In the ancient author Strabo said, not for every man is the journey to Corinth. Kind of like a blanket warning about, when you get there, watch your wallet kind of thing. That makes sense when you read 1 Corinthians, because the problem Paul has in 1 Corinthians is Paul comes there and he's preaching a gospel of freedom from the law and freedom in Christ. And the Corinthians are like, woohoo, let's go for it. And you end up with a situation where somebody's sleeping with their mother-in-law. And so the other kind of subtext in Corinth is Paul kind of trying to rein them in a little bit because they're about 30 yards ahead of him. It's the exact opposite problem he has in Galatia. Okay, here's the bema. Okay, so here's where I'm going to be a little bit mean. But when you go there, and it sounds like some of you had this experience, this is right in the central marketplace, the Agora. It's a stone platform, mostly used for speeches by visiting dignitaries, sometimes judicial pronouncements and things like that. Okay, and so one time I was there all by myself, and they were closing early and I was cranky. And I was at the back of this tour group, and the tour guide was standing right where that plaque is. And she was like, "Here's where Paul was." And I just sort of took it upon myself to sow some dissension in the back of this tour group and point out the difficulties in what the tour guide was saying. She did not appreciate it. Again, the problem is all of those stories are from the Acts of the Apostles. And every time in the Acts of the Apostles that Paul goes to a city, the same exact thing happens. Paul goes there, he goes to the synagogue, he preaches to the Jews, terrible things. This is what Paul says. "You stupid, stiff-necked Jews, how could you not believe in Jesus?" Lo and behold, the Jews don't like that. They beat him up. They kick him out of the synagogue. And then Paul says, "Oh my gosh, the Jews have rejected Jesus. I better go preach to the Gentiles." Okay. There is no point anywhere in any of Paul's letters that he talks about going to a synagogue. It's very clear that Paul's mission was always to preach to the Gentiles, to the non-Jewish people. And so, again, that story of what happens to Paul in Corinth is a narrative of Luke's theology to try to just justify the mission to the Gentiles. And it really has no basis in fact as far as we can tell. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Yep.
When I read Paul, that's a fulfillment of what the Gospels. Even the parable about wedding invitation has to be invited to show up, and the master goes out and invites just anyone. So that's Paul fulfills that.
Sure. So
Because they hear the message, but then Jesus is already showing this message is for the rest of the world. And part of that is because some Jews rejected the message, which gave rise to, still have plenty of room in the Catholic Church. Our closest brethren aren't going to take it. Let's keep evangelizing and move on to maybe some willing listeners who will, even if they're not Jewish.
Sure. So, I mean, you're absolutely right that the Gospels are chock full of stories that show that ethnic tension in early Christianity, right? Absolutely. The problem, it's not a problem, the fact is that the Gospels are written after Paul, right? And so they are, when they're talking about tension between Jew and Gentile, it's probably more likely a reflection of ethnic tension later in the first century that may not fully be historically accurate to the actual life of Jesus. Does that make sense? So, no, they're not. That's not Catholic teaching. The Gospels are not infallible. That's not what Dei Verbum says. Dei Verbum says that the Gospels were written, they're historical in character, but they were always written with the situation toward the eye of their churches. So the Gospel authors have some literary license to represent the time in which they were written as layered on top of the historical Jesus. But the church does not say that the Bible is infallible. It's inspired, but it's not infallible. That's not Catholic teaching. And if you want to talk about that more in a break or something, we can, okay? Um, go ahead, that's fine.
Real quickly, did the gospel writers have access to Paul's letters?
That's a good question. We don't know the answer to that. Did the gospel authors have Paul's letters? We don't know. Yeah, there's no way to know that. Probably. There's no way to know for sure. Yeah. The bigger point about this is right on, which is that from the very earliest parts of the church, there was this dual mission, partly to the Jewish people. That's what Peter was charged with, and to the Gentiles. Okay. And this was hard because this is a kind of ethnic mixing that didn't happen. Paul and Peter struggled to live it out. This is why in the Gospels, you see story after story that is trying to make an argument for why Jew and Gentile are both now enfolded into the plan of God. And that's built also on some ideas that are already there embedded in the Hebrew Bible. But that is, think about even in our world today, how we still struggle to integrate with people who are different from us ethnically, right? This is a hard thing, and the early church struggled with it, if that makes sense. Anyway, so the point is, this is probably not where Paul was. But what did Paul do in Corinth? I don't know why I had that picture twice. This is kind of what we were talking about earlier. When Paul admits he didn't come with big, fancy speeches. He says, "When I came to you, brothers and sisters, I did not come proclaiming the mystery of God to you in lofty words or wisdom. I came to you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. My speech and my proclamation were not with plausible words of wisdom, but with a demonstration of the Spirit and of power." So he there is already admitting his modus operandi, the way he did things, was not to come and start giving speeches. What Paul did is he found a job, and he worked in something like this, a workshop, which is quite close to that platform where people think he was. We don't know if this is the one he was in, but ringing the agora, the marketplace, were a series of shops where Paul worked in some sort of leather trade, maybe a tent maker. And in that, he built a network, got to know people. His ministry really starts in a grassroots way. Okay. And I think that's important. We need to get that right about Paul, because even though he's, he frustrates us sometimes, perhaps, he is at his heart wanting to build community. I mean, I think that's really true. And I think it's an important kind of hermeneutical lens through which to give Paul a generous reading. Okay. Maybe this would be a good time to, well, let me pause. Any other questions, comments right now that would be helpful before we take a little break? Mm-hmm.
Today, I had a lead article with the question of, was Paul a slave, a bondservant in his family?
So a question about, was Paul a slave or a bondservant? He certainly calls himself a slave. And he talks about slavery quite often. One of his letter to Philemon is all about a runaway slave. I don't know that there's any evidence. I haven't seen scholars making arguments that Paul himself was a slave. I don't know what the evidence for that would be.
Like a bondservant.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, ancient slavery is very different from kind of modern chattel slavery, but I have not encountered that argument, at least within scholarly circles. Yeah. Was there another question? Yeah. How long was I in Corinth? Well, how long was Paul there? Sorry, you don't care about me. Paul was probably there for about a year and a half, we think. Yeah. So, and I think most estimates would suggest while he was there, those games were put on, which kind of makes sense, right? So, again, it's hard to know for sure, but that as best we can kind of reconstruct it, that's kind of what we think. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions at this point? Yeah, one more maybe.
I was just wondering, did he have coworkers that we know of?
Yeah, absolutely. So that would be a whole nother interesting, or at least interesting to me, talk would be to unpack all of that. So, we mentioned already Prisca and Aquila, who were sort of like early church migrants in the sense they lived in Rome, they got kicked out of Rome, they lived in Corinth. We know they were in Ephesus. This is like a early first century power couple that were a huge support for Paul. Certainly he mentions here Apollos, Barnabas, are other people who were travel companions of him at some points. Timothy, somebody named Epaphroditus. John Mark, sure. So there's also women that show up. If you look at the end of Romans, Phoebe, whom he calls a deacon. There's a woman there named Mary. There's a woman in Romans 16, he calls an apostle, Andronicus and Junia. So he was not a lone wolf by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right, maybe one more.
I'm just finding it interesting that he talked badly about women, but yet was the first one who actually called out a deaconess.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, he actually, just to be technical, he doesn't say deaconess. It's not a feminized version of the word. It's anyway, it's not a big deal, but yeah, this is a confounding thing with Paul, is that he seems to sort of say one thing but do something else. And that is a hard thing to navigate, which is interesting. In the spring, this coming spring, I'm teaching I don't think this has been taught here at the School of Theology before, but I'm going to teach a class on women in the New Testament and in early Christianity. And so that'll be fun to kind of dive into that with our students and read what scholars are saying about it and kind of think through the implications of all of that. So one more. What's that?
The women.
You want that one next year? Okay, we'll talk to Grace, okay? All right, so how long should we break? 10 minutes. So if we come back about 10:30, is that right? And just so you know, I have these books up here these are not my books. These are like just some scholarly books about Corinth. There's an archaeological map. I just thought if anybody was interested in nosing through those, you're more than welcome to look at that. So, and I'm happy to chat in the break here too. So. It's always a good sign when you're behind, because that means you've had all sorts of interesting questions and probably I talked too long, which is pretty much standard. So, but I really do appreciate it. I sometimes joke when I come to things like this that nobody is forcing any of you to be here, as far as I know. And what's that? Oh yeah, I forced my parents. Emma Jean, is Eleanor forcing you to be here? No, okay. So it is very humbling and inspiring for me to see people who are interested in the stuff that I'm interested in. And it does kind of, it's very energizing. So I just appreciate your questions, your inquisitiveness, and it's fun. So I hope it's been the same for you, and we're not done. So what we have left is, I think, about an hour, maybe a little more than an hour. Is that right? Okay. to do a deeper dive into a couple spots. And I may even throw this to the tables briefly, but do you have a handout with some text on it, biblical text?
Yes.
Okay. So look at the first one of those, 1 Corinthians chapter 8. You see that there? Everybody got that? I'm going to read this, and then maybe just at your tables for like 2 or 3 minutes, just have you talk to maybe some of these tables maybe need to group into half, but what seems to be the problem? Okay. And there's probably more than one thing you could identify. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. So, but I'm just going to start by reading it. Now, concerning food sacrificed to idols. I'm already stopping myself. Remember I said earlier that phrase, now concerning, now in regards to. This is one of these items that the Corinthians had asked Paul about. Okay. Now concerning food sacrificed to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Anyone who claims to know something does not yet have the necessary knowledge. But anyone who loves God is known by him. Hence, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that no idol in the world really exists, and that there is no God but one. Indeed, even though there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as in fact there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. It is not everyone, however, who has this knowledge, since some have become so accustomed to idols until now that they think of food they eat as food offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Food will not bring us close to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do. But take care that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if others see you, who possess knowledge, eating in the temple of an idol, might they not, since their conscience is weak, be encouraged to the point of eating food sacrificed to idols? So by your knowledge, those weak believers for whom Christ died are destroyed. But when you thus sin against members of your family and wound their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food is a cause of their falling, I will never eat meat, so that I might not cause one of them to fall. It's a great chapter. So if you would, and if you're online and want to just drop an observation into the Q&A, just group up either at your table or 2 groups at a table and just share with each other what you see being problems. What are some of the problems you can identify here, okay? Hopefully a few ideas have been generated, so let's just share a few ideas and we'll kind of see where that takes us. And yeah, go ahead. And let's make sure that the mic comes around. And I think maybe we've got a couple from the Q&A online too, okay?
Thanks. So I think one of our first questions was, what really was going on at this time that had food and idolatry connected? Like,
Good.
what was it that was a part of that in the first place?
Okay, I see a lot of people nodding their heads. So you all probably saw there's something going on here with food and idols, something along those lines, okay? So we will definitely get into that, okay? Good. Glad you identified that. And even asking that question, thinking that question, great instinct. You should really ask that question about every time you read scripture, maybe not the Psalms, but almost every spot should be, what was this text going through? Is a nice way I like to think about it. Yeah, some Q&A.
Yeah, from online. It says Paul addresses the problem Paul addresses is seeming idolatry and resulting scandal. Jewish Christians had strong prohibitions about doing anything connected to idolatry. Jews did not eat at temples, only ate kosher food, and anything consecrated to an idol was forbidden.
Yes.
Or-
Okay.
yeah.
Great. Yeah.
And then same with another. So concerned about the issue of food, but of unity, so that no one in the community was harmed.
Yeah. Yeah. So hopefully you could see also an issue there. He calls a group of people, you see how he refers to them, do not become a stumbling block to the weak, right? So Paul divides the community up into strong and weak, which is really interesting. And we'll come back to that idea too, okay? Other things you notice that were problems or issues or questions that, that came up. Where else could we go? Over here?
We were talking about the fact that the culture that Paul came from was different from those of the apostles, and that he was Roman and he knew Roman law, and therefore he was addressing the people who followed that Roman law and were also Roman.
Sure. So this is a really important point. You're right. Paul was from a completely different world than Peter and James and John. They spoke different languages. Peter and James and John and Jesus all spoke Aramaic. Paul was a native Greek speaker. And in fact, most indications are he didn't know Hebrew, maybe a little bit. All of Paul's Jewish education was done in the language of Greek. All of his letters are written in Greek. In fact, this is a snippet from his letter to the Galatians, I think. Yeah. In Greek. So that's really important. And then, so I should have mentioned this at the beginning. When Paul, but it relates to things we've talked about. Paul's mission was to the Gentiles. We talked about that. When we think about Paul's community here in Corinth, in Ephesus, and Thessalonica, these are all non-Jewish people in his churches. They are all Greek-speaking. Use the word Romans. They are living in a Roman world. They probably actually don't identify as Romans. They probably identify more with their local cities or areas, but they're definitely living in the Roman world. Latin's not important. None of them speak Latin. Greek-speaking polytheists. I don't like to use the word pagan because it sounds pejorative. These are people, the people Paul is writing to in Corinth are not Jewish people. These are people who grew up worshiping Zeus and Apollo and Athena and Asclepius. So sometimes I ask my students, what would it take? I'll ask you, what would it take for you to wake up tomorrow? I presume you are all monotheists. You all believe in one God. Okay. I have a student, undergrad student right now who's a polytheist. I've never encountered that before. It's a brave new world, but very interesting student. Anyway, but what would it take for you tomorrow to wake up and suddenly believe in 12 gods, real gods, Poseidon? You're going to sacrifice to Poseidon before you go out in your fishing boat. Is that a weird thing to even think about? Well, no. Well, I know, yeah. I should probably try it, is what you're suggesting. I should sacrifice just to get my kids to want to go on the boat in the first place. Anyway, imagine the reverse. This is what Paul is asking these people to do. They have been worshiping multiple gods in Corinth, literally for thousands of years. And overnight, he's asking them suddenly to believe that all those gods are fake. That is a huge thing to ask. And that's part of this cultural background, for sure. Yeah. Mhm.
Appreciate it.
Oh, sorry.
I appreciate if you distinguish the definition of the word knowledge, which you referenced 4 times, from that of providing information, given that historical
Yeah.
context.
Paul uses the word knowledge here a lot. This is the word gnosis in Greek, and it does connote something different than information. Yeah, I think we're talking here about sort of a deep knowing, the kind of knowing you feel in your bones.
But then to give that to people who essentially are ignorant, require knowledge.
Yeah, that's right. That again, this relates to this big idea that he is asking them to really transform their entire worldview. That's a deep gnosis, a deep kind of knowing that you have to have. And obviously, at some level, the community is struggling with it, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It seems to me here that Paul is aware that he's become a leader, and a special kind of leader, which is a role model. And as a role model, even though he has insight about why he's doing things, he has to be careful so that people don't become confused. So it's kind of the issue of a role model comporting themselves in a way that doesn't create confusion.
Yeah, it's a really interesting comment. I last spring I taught a School of Theology class on Paul, and I had a little bit. I taught Paul to some deacons, but to have a room full of 25 students who were almost all of them going to be going into ministry, and we had fascinating conversations about Paul as a leader, as a pastor, as a minister. And quite often he does a lot of really interesting, smart things. We also, we could also critique him. Sometimes he maybe doesn't make the best moves. But I do think you do see him here intentionally trying to put himself out there as a model, somebody to follow. I would never go so far as he does to say, I'll never eat meat. I mean, that's crazy talk, at least where I come from. But it shows the level of commitment that he has, right? So, yeah. Maybe one or two more? Yeah.
Yes. These sacrifices and the distribution of food, did that also serve a community purpose of feeding the population?
Yes. Yep. I'm going to talk about that more in a second too. Yep. Yep. All right. One more and then we'll move on. This is great, you all. This is really great.
It's more question. Did they use metaphors, in those days, such as food, also talking about the poor or the weak in that sense?
Well, absolutely, they use metaphors. I mean, our next text, if we get to it, is chapter 11, which is what I would call an extended metaphor of the body of Christ. Yeah. So absolutely. Yeah. Here, though, it's not metaphorical. We're talking about food, real food. Yeah. So I think it's different. But I hope by the end we'll see how these two converge. Yeah. Good. Anything else online that we should put forward? Okay. All right. Good. So I think this is great. I mean, I think, do you see on your sheet how at the beginning these little phrases are in quotation marks? Okay. This is not in the original Greek. We don't know that Paul was thinking this way, but the reason those quotation marks are there is because scholars think that these, like the first one, all of us possess knowledge. The next one, there is no God but one. These feel like slogans, bumper stickers, little pithy teachings that Paul may have left with the Corinthians. And so that's why the editors of your Bible put them in quotation marks to try to indicate that this looks to us like something Paul may have previously taught to the community there. Does that make sense? So that's I just kind of an interesting nugget that I mean it relates to what he's trying to accomplish, I think. Okay, so let's look. So this is the temple to Apollo. And this is right in the center of Corinth. It's on a small little hill. You could not go anywhere in Corinth in the ancient world without seeing this. Right past it runs the Lachian Road, which ran down to the port. This was, in a lot of ways, kind of the center of the city. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. There were also temples on every corner. Okay, so it's not like this was the only one. They're everywhere, along with statues of gods and important figures to whom they would bring offerings and things like that. This temple has its origins back in the 7th century BCE. Okay. So by the time Paul comes to Corinth, people have been worshiping Apollo on this site for 700 to 800 years. Okay, it's a long time. We talked about this earlier about the depth with which their religious system was embedded into the social fabric of the lives of these people in the church in Corinth. There are several ways, I feel like, again, I'm getting ahead of myself, but it's fine. There are several ways that this meat issue could have presented itself as a problem to the Corinthian church. One of them was social. It's Friday night. They're going to sacrifice a bull to Apollo. And everybody's going. And you are a part of this church that Paul just started. You have to think about whether or not I can go. All my friends are going, my neighbors, my whole social network. And now Paul has asked me to believe something different. I have chosen to believe something different because of the power of the spirit that I've experienced in the community. But that's a tough thing, suddenly not to be able to participate in that. We also have very good evidence from the ancient world that almost everybody's diet was protein deficient. Okay, so, and we can tell this when we dig up bodies. We examine their bones and their teeth. We can tell whether a body excavated as part of archaeology was a rich person or a poor person by looking at their bones and teeth. That's as much as I know about it. I don't science. But we can tell a lot. And so people they weren't starving, but most people were at a subsistence level and they all needed protein. And so religious meat was one of the primary ways that people got protein in their diets. So we're not just talking about something social, we're talking about people's health. Okay. Another way this could have presented itself to the Corinthian church was sometimes meat used in a sacrifice would then make its way to the market. And it would be sold, and it's weird, but sometimes it was cheaper. It was like used meat. Sorry, they don't say used anymore. When you go to the car dealership, pre-owned. Pre-owned meat. Sounds great, doesn't it? But that was another way. Can I eat that meat? Okay. Does that all make sense? Let me just show you a little more. That's everything I just said. Here are the remains of a temple to Asclepius. You know what Asclepius was in charge of as a god? God of medicine and healing. Yep. Asclepius was like the ancient Mayo Clinic. Okay. Centricare, sorry. So there's not much of it left, but this was kind of right outside of the center of Corinth. And it is, when you study ancient Asclepius, it's really interesting because ancient people had a lot of health problems, and the temples to Asclepius were always outside of the city. They were always near a spring or fresh water, clean air, clean water. I mean, it was sort of like going to the spa. You know how if you go up north for a week and you come back and you just feel amazing, unless you eat and drink too much that week. I mean, it's kind of the idea, right? And so here's kind of a reconstruction. It wasn't a very big temple. There was always a statue of the god in a temple, but a temple was really a house for the god. The worshipers never went in the temples. All of the sacrifice and the worship happened outside the temple. The altar was outside. And so then here are the kind of the archaeological plans for what this site of the temple to Asclepius looked like. I don't know how well you can see this, but on the upper left, you have kind of this is the top-down view. That makes sense? So you're seeing the temple in the center, the altar out front. One of the really interesting things about Asclepius is you see on the top, it says ramp. This is very rare in the ancient world, but this temple had a ramp to get up onto the main platform, which makes sense as a place where people who were suffering various ailments or handicaps were coming to the temple. It was like handicap accessible, okay? Anyway, the important part about this is in the back. There was a courtyard with a series of covered rooms. And these rooms, so far as we can tell, were for nothing other than eating. So they would sacrifice to Asclepius. The meat would, very few sacrifices in the ancient world were what we think of as a whole Holocaust, where they were burnt offerings. Sometimes they would take the choice parts and burn them, but almost always the meat was cooked and eaten. And so this is just kind of really tangible evidence right in Corinth, again, of the kind of way that this religious meat was built into the social fabric of the whole community. Okay. One other example, I'm sorry I'm in this picture. I didn't have another picture of the Acrocorinth. And it kind of looks like I'm yelling at my students, doesn't it? I assure you I was saying something nice. I also look very young in that picture. Anyway, so in the background of this picture is something called the Acrocorinth, the High Corinth. People who have visited Corinth, did any of you go up there? You did? We were going to when I was there with my family, but it was snowing and the road was not passable. So on the slope below the Acrocorinth was a whole bunch of temples. And one of them was a temple to Demeter and Persephone, or sometimes called Cori. Do any of you know the myth of Demeter and Persephone? So this is the one where Hades kidnaps, Persephone is Demeter's daughter. Demeter is the god of grain and agriculture. Hades captures the daughter and takes her back to hell. And there's a bunch of things that happen, but basically half the year Persephone is down in hell, half the year she's up with her mother. And the times when she's down in hell with Hades is when it's winter. Okay, and Demeter kind of wanders the earth weeping and crying, looking for her daughter. And then when she comes back, things start growing again. But this temple is really interesting. There were several temples. Our evidence suggests it was only women who went out here. And they were literally pigging out. Tons and tons of religious feasting, mostly with piglets. Almost all of the bones we find up there are of young pigs. And so when you go, what's that? Yeah, good question. So it's mostly literary in nature. So we do find women's things up there. So we'll find hairpins and some, but it's mostly literary evidence. So we have, I mentioned earlier this, there was a guy named Pausanias, and he was sort of like the original Rick Steves. And he went around the ancient Greek world visiting famous places. And then he wrote about it. And so he's one of our main sources for knowing that it was only women who went out there. Yeah. That's a good question. I'm glad I knew the answer because at first I was like, I don't know how we know that, but it came to me. So when you get up there, it's beautiful. It's kind of, you're overlooking the valley. You can see the ocean in the background. And most of what we find are, you see this floor, this is a mosaic floor that would have been a dining room floor. The archaeologists say that there were up to 40 dining rooms up there on the side of the hill where women were going and eating together. They were also producing curse tablets. I'm going to read this just because it's so interesting. There was one of the curse tablets we have up there. It seems like there was a woman who was infertile, and there were other women making fun of her. And she produced a curse tablet to destroy the life of this woman who was making fun of her. Okay, so I get chills when I read this because it's so crazy. So anyway, this is what her curse says, okay? I entrust and consign Carpine Babia, weaver of garlands, to the fates who exact justice, so that they may punish her acts of insolence, to Hermes of the underworld, to earth, to the children of the earth, so that they may overcome and completely destroy her soul and heart and her mind and the wits of Carpine Mabia, weaver of garlands. I adjure you and I implore you and I pray to you, Hermes of the underworld, that the mighty name of Ananke make me fertile, that the mighty name, the one carrying compulsion, which is not named recklessly unless in dire necessity, make me fertile and destroy Carpine Babia, weaver of garlands, from her head to her footsteps with monthly destruction. So don't get on this woman's bad side. But what's embedded, I don't know, we're kind of off topic, but it's just too interesting not to talk about it. I mean, what's behind this is just this suffering. This woman is suffering. And her outlet for that suffering is a religious feasting kind of safe place where she can produce these tablets and presumably there be in a kind of a liberated space. If that makes sense. Okay.
Because I was thinking the women were making little pills, tablets to go and poison.
No, they're not trying to poison anyone. They're just calling on the gods to destroy them from head to foot. Yeah, yeah. Oh, a tablet. Yes, but it was a cursed tablet, like this was written into carved into stone. I think this one's actually punched into bronze. Yeah, 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 yeah. Okay. Too many pictures of this. Okay, so sometimes I call this ladies' night out. That's meant to be funny, but again, it's a community around a meal. We don't know how this was viewed by society really, because it was kind of secretive. That Demeter and Persephone, it's a mystery cult, so they tended not to write things about themselves. But let's just try to pull some of these threads together. Well, we're running short on time, so I'm just going to kind of say this, but I hope you can see when you go back to 1 Corinthians 8, hopefully you have a much better sense now of kind of the vibrant way in which meat and religiosity were connected together, right? It's really powerful. And I think even though this was polytheistic practice, it's not totally different, I think, from the kind of way in which Paul's understanding of the Lord's Supper functions in a historical context. They were also gathering around a meal trying to form communal identity. Right, so that even our understanding of the Lord's Supper in the Pauline context is has these analogous situations in the ancient world. So I think that's powerful to recognize. What's interesting, though, is how Paul makes his argument. Well, let me ask you if you picked up on this. In a technical sense, is it okay to eat this meat? Okay, good. And the reason is because these gods are fake. These gods don't exist. So a chunk of meat is no different if it's been sacrificed to Zeus or not, because Zeus is fake. Okay. However, should you eat that meat? Well, when could you eat it? Yeah, okay, if you want to hide in your closet and eat the meat. Yeah, if nobody sees you, maybe it's okay. That's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think yep. Yeah, the source of the division would, I think, be this. Some people, because they're strong, have fully left behind their former lives in polytheism and are able to eat religious meat, and they're not scandalized by it. They don't slip back on their faith. But some people, the weak, Paul calls them, they can't handle it. They can't both believe in one God, the God of Israel, and eat that meat because it causes them to kind of backslide into their old religious faith and practices of polytheism. Does that make sense? So I think that's how Paul divides up the community. Okay. And the point of all of this is to just make clear what Paul's argument is basically, can you do this? Yes. Should you do it? Basically, I think the answer is no. Maybe there are some exceptions, but your entire ethical outlook needs to be focused on the other and what that person needs, not what you can do. Does that make sense? So I think, how do I say it here? What we know and what we practice are not the same thing. Sometimes, I don't know, the analogy I think of this with this is like I think it was last Thanksgiving, we hosted a bunch of family at our house. My cousin Joe is a recovering alcoholic, right? Is it okay to have wine at Thanksgiving? Yes. Do I kind of wish we had? Yes. You know, it helps with the relatives, right? But Joe can't be around it. And so for his behalf, we don't do it. I mean, it's not exactly apples to apples comparison, but that's the kind of logic that Paul is trying to get at. Okay. Then ultimately, where does this come from? Why is Paul arguing this way? In fact, I could envision a different argument from Paul. What if Paul puts the burden of action on the strong? He could have put the burden of action on the weak. He could have said, come on, you slow dummies. Get with the program. Don't you understand these gods are fake? come on, eat that meat, eat it, eat it, eat it, and maybe you'll get over yourself because you're just weak and stupid. I mean, that's not, Paul might sound that way sometimes, but he doesn't do that. The burden of action is on the strong. Maybe it's too strong of a word to say sacrifice, but to make provision for the weaker member of the body. And so the question is why? Why is that the argument that he makes? And I think there's only one answer to that, which is that it is the shape of the way of life that Jesus himself lived. The source of Paul's argumentation ultimately is cruciform. Paul is imitating for his community as he imitates Christ, and that is the same shape of a life that he asks his community to live with. You got to scratch behind the surface here to get there, but I think if you read Paul, if you read 1 Corinthians as a whole, I think it becomes pretty obvious eventually, right? He doesn't ever say that explicitly here, but it's kind of the bedrock of his argument in the whole letter, which is how do we achieve unity? It is through seeking the good of the other. It's not really equality, even. It's something more radical than that. Okay, let me just pause there. Just a couple minutes maybe for any questions, comments, reactions to this. We are going to still bring this back to hope eventually, I promise. We haven't talked about hope at all, but that's your fault, not my fault. Okay, so thank you.
I have a question, and this deals with polytheism and pre-Christian traditions and the Catholic saints. And so I've seen many I've seen a few basilicas in Europe, and especially in Italy and Spain, and they have a ton of saints in the area, and some of the basilicas that I've been to are built on former temples, and it's interesting to see the personas of the people whose pre-Christian temple it was and the person it's dedicated to, especially with Mary. And I'm wondering what Paul would have thought of the integration of saints within the Catholic tradition, if he would have seen that maybe as a way of integrating polytheistic views, or if that would have been a connection that he would have drawn at all.
It's a good question. I mean, you're absolutely right. That is a huge part of how the church grows and unfolds. Sorry, I'm going to sneeze again. My wife and I were in Mexico City back in May, and we saw some very similar, fascinating things of kind of blending of evangelization with indigenous cultures. It was just amazing. I think for Paul, I don't think he would have liked it. Paul has no place for the continuance of that. And that's not to say that what Catholics do or Christians do with veneration of saints is polytheistic, but it's definitely kind of built on that model. There's an impulse, I think, within humans for, sacramentals, right? For little tangible things that connect us to the past and to stories. And so I think it's definitely a thing. And, within scholarship, we would call it even something like syncretism, in which those practices are being adopted by the new religion. But I don't think Paul would have liked it. For Paul, Christ is the end of everything that came before. And he does not like, he's a pretty black and white thinker in that regard. Yeah.
Paul would have family.
He wouldn't have had family photos. Maybe not. Yeah, maybe not. Just any other thoughts or comments at this point before we move on? Feel like we're mostly, you're with me? Yeah, okay. Okay, so let's go to the last example. All right, 1 Corinthians 12. So that's going to be on the other side of your sheet. I'll just take the time to read this too, because I think it's worthwhile. I apologize, I'm reading from a different translation, but I kind of like that actually. If it confuses you, I apologize, but I think it's actually interesting to hear different. So I think I've given you the New American Bible Revised Edition. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Anyway. So we're picking it up, 1 Corinthians 12, 12 through 26. For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For in the one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free. And we were all made to drink of one Spirit. Indeed, the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot would say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear would say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? If the whole body were hearing, where would the sense of smell be? But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them, as he chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many members, yet one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And those members of the body that we think less honorable, we clothe with greater honor. And our less respectable members are treated with greater respect, whereas our more respectable members do not need this. But God has so arranged the body, giving the greater honor to the inferior member, that there may be no dissension within the body, but the members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it. If one member is honored, all rejoice together with it. Okay, so I was going to go back into groups, but I don't think we really have time for that now, which is fine. I think the metaphor here makes sense, right? The body, this is like foundational image for how Christianity has understood the church across the centuries. In my most recent book, I wrote about this a little bit, but I'm fascinated by how Paul's use of the metaphor here, it first starts off and it makes perfect sense, right? He's making basically biological observations. You have, you need all the parts. They all have to work together. They're all essential. None is more important than the other. They're interdependent, right? That makes intuitive sense. But in the middle, he kind of makes a turn. In verse 22, the members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. Now, I'm not a doctor. I know there's some in the room. When I go for a walk in the winter, which parts of my body get cold first? Your extremities, your fingers, your nose, your ears, your toes, right? Well, why is that?
Endpoint circulation.
Endpoint circulation, that sounds official. But isn't the basic idea, if my pinky falls off, I will survive. If my heart freezes, it's over, right? So that makes sense biologically. What's interesting is Paul, maybe it's that he's never experienced the Minnesota winter, so he doesn't really know what it's like. But as we know, it can get cold in Greece. The second half of the metaphor becomes anti-biological. He's saying, let's pump blood to the little toe and to the pinky and to the earlobe rather than the things that we think are important. Does that make sense? It's really interesting how he sort of turns the biological nature of the metaphor on its head. And again, hopefully you can see the connection here with the text we just talked about, which is that Paul here is again making an argument in a very different way, but the argument is basically the same. Seek the good of the weaker one, the weaker member. So we're back to the Temple of Asclepius. I know you missed it. It's still there. It's just some bare rock. But there's more here we can explore that are going to help us kind of, I don't know, understand the context of what Paul is talking about. Here's just a little sculpture of the god Asclepius. It's very small. It looks big in the picture, but it's very small. And then on the right-hand side are two inscriptions that were found in the temple to Asclepius. And so the way the temple to Asclepius worked is when you were infirmed and you wanted to experience this healing, you would go to the temple. Often you had to pay some kind of little fee or charge. And then you would go and you would make your sacrifices or offerings to the god. And then there was an area of the temple called the abaton. And in Greek, the word abaton means it's a place you're not supposed to step. The only people who could go in the abaton were people who had gone through the initial sacrifices to go there. You go in the abaton and you spend the night. Sleep there. And what's supposed to happen then, Asclepius comes to you in a dream and tells you what to do for your healing. Or sometimes even does something in the dream and you wake up and you've been healed. Okay? And so in what would happen then, people would experience this healing and they would write about it. They'd set up an inscription, usually in thanksgiving, but often sometimes telling the story of what they had done and how they were healed. The other thing they would do is they would dedicate to the god a body part. So there's a little room in the museum in Corinth, and I don't know if those of you who've been there remember going in here, and it's filled with clay body parts. And in fact, we have, I don't know how they do this, but archaeologists are pretty sure that there was enough of this going on that these were being mass produced. So after you visited the temple and had your healing, you could just like go to the body part store, and if Asclepius fixed your trick knee, you could buy a knee and go hang it off the side of the temple and go on your, merry way. And so pretty much every part of the body is in this display. So just, that's a warning. Okay. Okay. Should I leave that one behind now? Okay. Oh, let me give it back up one. So it's really fascinating, right? When Paul talks about there are many parts, it's just impossible for me to think both he and his community are not immediately thinking of all of these body parts that are hanging off the temple and displayed all around the temple to Asclepius in Corinth. And what Paul does is, assemble these back into function within his metaphor. But it gets better. I have a couple of these. You seem to like that quotation earlier. One of these is it's not PG rated, okay? So I apologize in advance. The first one is great. So here's an example of one of these little inscriptions that somebody would leave for Asclepius. A guy named Hyrieus of Mytilene, quote, "He did not have hair on his head, but a great deal on his chin. Being ashamed because he was laughed at by others, he slept in the shrine. And the god, anointing his head with a drug, made him grow hair." So, if any of you are feeling this, you can, I'm getting there. I'm happy to show you where the Abaton is in Corinth and maybe see what could happen. Another one, there came a suppliant to the god, a man who was so one-eyed that the other had only lids in which there was nothing. But they were completely empty. So he's missing an eye. Certain people in the temple laughed at his simplicity in thinking that he would see with an eye that was not there. Then a vision appeared to him as he slept. The god seemed to boil some medicine and drawing apart the lids to pour it in. When day came, he went out seeing with both eyes. This last one is the one that's a little awkward. A man had a stone in his penis. It's okay to laugh, sorry. He saw a dream. He seemed to lie down with a handsome boy, and having a seminal discharge, he ejected the stone and picking it up, walked out with it in his hands. So it's ancient history, people. I'm not making it up. I mean, you can, obviously part of that's awkward, but you can imagine some site, a kidney stone or a gallstone that somebody is passing. I've never been through that, but I know people who have, and I've heard it's not enjoyable. So, okay. What's the point of all this? Again, I just think it's impressive to notice the way in which Paul's not just making this stuff up, right? It's embedded in this context. And all of this would have had meaning for the people in Corinth to whom he's writing. They would have, I think, intuitively associated what Paul is talking about with these images from what would have been their everyday lives, right? Okay, I think most of that we've talked about. Prioritizing the weaker member. But I do think there's this interesting way, and I talk about this in my book, but this is really kind of what I would say is sort of a biblical foundation for the church's teaching on solidarity. When you read, I think the best person who's expressed this is Pope John Paul II. He talks about solidarity is not just a feeling of vague compassion. Solidarity is not just, changing your Facebook profile when there's a tragedy. It is a real and firm, lifelong commitment to the good of the other that should require of us deep sacrifice. And that's exactly what the body image is saying, right? To send blood to the pinky toe is going to mean there's going to be less of it to go around for the rest of the body. And Paul thinks that's fine. as he says, because they do not need this. Somebody else needs it. So the oh, thank you for fixing. There was a typo in this earlier. Thank you for fixing it. The awkward, so let's talk about hope now, finally, in the last 7 minutes. Okay. When I started working on this and thinking about it, putting it together, the awkward thing was always, this was the verse always stuck in the back of my mind, that in Corinthians, Paul seems less interested in hope and faith, and because of this verse, right? And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greater of these is love. Maybe that's a typo. I think that should, whatever. You get the point. And so I'm thinking, well, why are we going to talk about hope in Corinth? I really want to talk about Corinth, but how are we going to talk about hope in Corinth when Paul seems to think hope is not the most important thing? But I think actually where I've landed is to suggest that for Paul, the way to get to hope is through love. And I think this is hard, and I'm not even sure what I think about this. Because quite often hope to me, when we talk about hope, it seems quite selfish, personally focused. I hope things for myself, for my family, and that does not seem to be how Paul thinks or talks about hope. Oh, sorry. That does not seem to be how Paul talks about hope. The primary thing is love, and that's really the best way to sum up the argument we saw about food, in the image of the body, and it is that love. I mean, if you think about it this way, as Christians, as people of faith in that tradition, where ultimately does our hope come from, right? It comes from God, and God has been revealed to us through the person of Jesus. And the way in which he lived his life and the love that he expressed, ultimately shown in the cross, is the source of our hope. So there's a way in which hope and love are almost synonyms. There's not a lot of daylight there between the two of them. But maybe I'm just struggling because I find this personally challenging to think about the idea that hope is not something that I engage in for my own benefit. Even when I say it out loud, it sounds weird to me. But I do think that's kind of the truth that Paul would want to confront us with today. Maybe I'll just stop there, and we have a few minutes here for conversation. What do you think about that? Maybe others of you have ways of thinking about how to connect the hope thing with what we've talked about here in Corinth. But I'm really just intrigued by this idea about the connection between sacrificial love and hope. Can you wait for the mic, please? Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, I think that's really profound in that when I look at the hatred in our society right now, and the hope people have, if our hope is just individual, it's not going to take care of the hatred and the negativity. But if we hope and love for a greater type of thing, then that's a much more powerful interaction. It's a much more powerful form of prayer too.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that makes sense to me. Yeah. Over here. Yeah. Can you wait for the mic, please? It's coming. Yep. Thanks.
Going back to this passage from Corinthians, I would have thought that talking about the less honorable, the less presentable parts of the body referred to things like internal organs or digestive system or things like that. I would never have associated with fingers or toes. Would what do you think about that understanding, and would that change your interpretation in any way?
That's interesting. I mean, I guess I hadn't thought about that. Again, it's an extended metaphor, right? So we may find different things in it. I mean, I would say those organs are still essential, right? Right. We need a digestive system, I presume. So, but I'm certainly open to playing with that idea too. It's interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting idea. Uh-huh.
It is. I think one of the things about hope and faith and love is that when we think about social justice, or we think about someone who's dying, or we think about the person who's weaker, that maybe the hope is that I have the courage and the strength to take care of that person, or to bring forth my gifts to the community, to the body, to the whole, and through the love that I have for that person, or this community, or this ethnic group, or church, or whatever, that I can have enough faith and hope to do what God is asking me to do.
Sure.
Because that's really hard sometimes to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I appreciate that. And I think I don't want to suggest that we can't have personal hope. You know, I was probably overstating the case, especially if that hope is oriented towards, you know, work that you're going to do that is positive in that way. So that, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. What else?
This was about concerns the latest school shooting.
Hold it closer to you.
The latest school shooting in Minneapolis. And one of my first reaction was, where the hell was God? So I know by faith, but it's hard to justify some of these things that happen. Why did that happen?
Yeah, well, obviously I don't have an answer to that question. But it's one we all need to be answering. It's one we all need to be asking. You know, the problem of suffering and evil is it's the question that makes us human. And yeah, it's not easy. I've been talking about it a lot with my students. And in fact, right now, my kids go to the prep school and they're having a walkout, and they're going to toll the death bell at the Abbey for 15 minutes and then lead into a prayer at noon on the steps of the Abbey. Anyway, so yeah, it's tough. I mean, there's you could have, you probably have had a whole theology day on the question of suffering or something like that. So it's tough. Yeah.
When we hope, that ascends to love. I think, like during the Mass, we have our prayer intentions, and we are hopeful for those, which is an expression of love.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's a nice way of trying to draw the connection. Yeah.
I'm especially drawn to 1 Corinthians 12-26, beginning with verse 22. And that is that we are not only, we are encumbered a little bit to especially pay attention. And I guess on a very specific level, we've got in Little Falls, and I know it's not just in Little Falls, a woman and 2 kids in a tent as school starts. And they've been there for some time. And I've been able to be honored to walk with them a little bit, but we still have that area, and how crucial that is to our our growth in faith, in love, and in hope at the same time. It's just amazing and wonderful.
Yeah, no, it's very hard. I mean, this idea of honoring is, we are not well set up to do that, right? And before I moved here, I worked quite a bit with the homeless in a place where we fed meals twice a day. And when you experience people who are really suffering in tough situations, they're not easy to be around all the time. It's very difficult. And so the idea of not just including them, but somehow honoring is certainly a high bar. But this text is foundational, probably should be more foundational. That's kind of what my book is about, for the church's social teachings. Our goals for society really have to be more than equality. Paul is asking for something qualitatively different than equality. It's an inversion. It's a reversal, a prophetic reversal. And that's much, much harder. Yeah.
To me, the real issue is what happens when we lose hope and we get resigned to what's happening, and then we just sort of roll over and play dead, and we lose our ability to love at that point as well.
Yeah, that's a nice reflection. Yeah. I think part of what Paul is saying is that what you're saying, those things all do go together, right? And you can't, they're like three legs on a stool. You can't have one without the others. Yeah. So are we done? Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been, I don't know, good for me. I hope you've enjoyed it.